For nearly a decade, Sheila Hole watched her son Brandon descend further into the depths of his mental illness. There were signs and red flags that were too obvious to ignore. Brandon Hole was different, and as the years went on, the more different and angrier he became. By 19 years old, he had developed an unusual obsession with the animated series My Little Pony and was on a path of destruction that would ultimately lead to a horrifying act of violence that would leave 9 dead, including Brandon. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. And do you ever have so much on your mind that you get on an elevator and for an unreasonable amount of time, you just stand there, wondering, why isn't this thing moving? And then you realize you haven't pushed a single button. Well, that's where I am at the current moment. Not literally on an elevator, but I've done that very recently. Maybe you can relate. This is my favorite time of the year, but it can get overwhelming. And I realize that there are people out there that don't like this time of year because it makes them feel negative feelings for a variety of reasons, and I get that. But I personally like the little things, like drinking hot cocoa while watching Christmas movies, having the glow of the lights from my Christmas tree in the living room. Just little things like that make me happy this time of year. But lately I've been so busy, mixed on top of last week me being sick, it's making me forget how to function in society. Luckily, I've got some time off that I'm going to take full advantage of. And that doesn't mean time off from this podcast. I'll still be doing this, but time off that I can just chill and do a bunch of nothing. Now that I have treated you as my personal therapist, let me sit up from the couch and remind you that you need to subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts and connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Also, if you enjoy this podcast, please rate and review it wherever you can do that and let your friends and family know about 10-Minute Murder. Now, to the story. Brandon Scott Hole was born on August 20th, 2001, and lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. Growing up, Brandon enjoyed simple activities like fishing and roller coasters, but around the age of 3, he experienced a traumatic event that would go on to shape and define the rest of his life. After his parents got into a heated argument, his father committed suicide by hanging. This incident would have a profound effect on Brandon and be a catalyst for the troubles to come. Around the same time of his father's death, Brandon began struggling with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and found it difficult to control his anger. Records show that Sheila had been dealing with Brandon's issues for years, with records going back nearly a decade. They showed Brandon had suffered from an anxiety disorder with panic attacks, major depressive disorder, and thoughts of suicide. Brandon was diagnosed with disruptive behavior disorder and anxiety disorder at the age of 10. Only a month later, he was officially diagnosed with OCD after Sheila described certain quirks in his behavior, like wanting to wear 3 pairs of shorts or rocking back and forth while he watched TV. If Brandon's routine was ever interrupted, he would end up taking hours to get ready. But his peculiar compulsions were not nearly as alarming as his rage. Brandon told a nurse that while he didn't want to be angry, sometimes he would just lose control. It seemed like the primary target for his anger was his mother. Sheila had to call the police on several occasions when Brandon was being physically abusive towards her. In 2013, Brandon was arrested for the first time. He was charged with battery, criminal confinement, and intimidation after he was accused of punching his mother in the face and stabbing her with a kitchen knife. He was only 11 years old. He was held at a juvenile facility for a few hours and a few weeks later would receive probation. This incident resulted in counseling, but it seemed not much came from it because Brandon was still suspended from school several times for fighting, and in 2014, Sheila began homeschooling him. For the next several years, Brandon spent most of his time isolated at home with very little socialization. He didn't have many friends, and by 2020, his anger was at an all-time high. For a short time, he was employed by FedEx facility in Indianapolis, but was subsequently fired when he failed to return to work one day. By then, Sheila was so terrified of her son's anger that eventually she desperately sought out help from law enforcement. In March of 2020, a concerned Sheila contacted local authorities about Brandon's threats of suicide by cop, as well as his purchase of a shotgun the day before. Police opened an investigation and went to their home, where Brandon was placed in handcuffs and taken to a hospital. When an officer went to confiscate the shotgun, he noticed white supremacist websites open on Brandon's computer. Brandon was placed in an immediate detention mental health temporary hold and was later questioned about the websites by the FBI, as well as his very evident obsession with the My Little Pony franchise. The investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. After Brandon was seen by a doctor and claimed that he was feeling fine, he was released within 2 hours, much to his mother's dismay. Brandon never received his shotgun back from the police, but would later legally purchase 2 assault rifles. In 2021, after Brandon somehow became even more unstable, his mother decided to take him for emergency counseling. He was deemed a moderate suicide risk and given a suicide plan. Despite Sheila's attempts to get Brandon the proper help, her greatest fears would soon be realized when Brandon went on to commit mass murder. On April 15, 2021, Brandon went to his former place of employment at a FedEx ground facility in Indianapolis. He began firing at employees in the parking lot before making his way inside the facility, where he would resume shooting. The shooting lasted less than 4 minutes, and by the time police arrived at the scene, Brandon had already taken his own life, as well as the lives of 8 other people. 4 victims were found outside, while the other 4 were inside, with many of the victims being members of the local Sikh community. When news of the shooting spread through the country, many people were left wondering if this attack was racially motivated. The media coverage would point to Brandon's strange obsession with the My Little Pony franchise as a possible answer. Less than an hour before his rampage, Brandon made a post on his Facebook page referencing the animated main character on the show, writing, quote, "I hope that I can be with Applejack in the afterlife. My life has no meaning without her." The often toxic subculture of adult male fans who call themselves bronies arose about a decade ago, and there seems to be a link between what is meant to be an innocent cartoon and white supremacy. As pockets on the internet formed for obsessed My Little Pony fans to come together, fan art would begin to depict violent and overly racist themes, like a fan-fictional pony that wears a swastika. With very little censorship in these digital spaces, over time, it has attracted a trove of neo-Nazis and white nationalists. Though there is certainly a pipeline from one to the other, there's no concrete evidence that Brandon's actions were racially motivated, and following the shooting, there was criticism from Brandon's family and the public for not carrying out Indiana's red flag law, which would have prohibited Brandon from purchasing firearms after his shotgun was confiscated. The FBI defined what Brandon did as a suicidal murder and a way for him to demonstrate his masculinity. Brandon's mother, Sheila, isn't sure what Brandon's true motivation was, but wishes that his patterns of abuse and troubling behavior was taken more seriously. Brandon's sister spoke out about their family history of mental illness after the shooting, and also believes more should have been done to get Brandon the proper help. Is it possible that this horrific mass shooting was preventable and Brandon Hole's life could have gone on a different path had more people intervened? Or was Brandon far too deep in the bottomless pit of hatred to ever be able to crawl out? Brandon's mental health issues could never justify the horrors he committed. 8 innocent people senselessly lost their lives that day at the hands of a 19-year-old who was angry at the world. The victims' families will have to carry these losses for the rest of their lives.